Governor Whitmer lays out her agenda. Can she get things done in a hot election year? Electric vehicles go cold, from charging in the ice to plant cutbacks. Are EVs still the future? And the reflections of a Lions fan who always kept the faith, me. Today is Sunday, January 28, 2024, and this is Flashpoint. Hi, welcome to Flashpoint. 8.5 hours before kickoff as the Lions try to win the NFC Championship. The last 2 weekends have been glorious and joyful, but they were also hosted by Ford Field. Change of venue today, but if the Lions' magic can continue, it's off to the most celebrated championship in American sports. A little later on, I'll share a few reflections on how the long struggle has made this season so much sweeter. But up first, we're going to talk politics. Wednesday night, Governor Whitmer delivered her State of the State address. Once again, it was filled with ideas cheered by her Democratic colleagues, while the Republicans in the room ask, how will we ever pay for them? We'll talk about her priorities, but we're also going to talk about what the 2024 elections will mean to her chances of success. And on that front, we've talked a lot about the efforts to lessen the import of Iowa and New Hampshire on the electoral process, and yet kind of feels like those two states have again decided the matter. We'll talk about that too. And electric vehicle drivers are confronting winter realities and the impact of cold weather on battery performance. But we also see that Ford has decided to pull resources away from its F-150 Lightning production. Big trouble or just a bump on the electrified road? We'll cover that too, all today on Flashpoint. Another busy political week between the New Hampshire primary and then Governor Whitmer's State of the State address, delivered somewhat oddly in a rock and roll themed speech. Let's get the reviews from my rock music critics. Political strategist Adolph Mongo is here. Political director for Michigan Public Radio, Zoe Clark, back with us. Former Speaker of the Michigan House, Tom Leonard, is here, and so is the editorial page editor of the Detroit News, Nolan Fenley. Tom, let me start with you. It was pretty noteworthy that, as these things always go, half the room stood up a lot, the other half sat down a lot. What were your real takeaways?
And I felt in this one with the Democrats, the one half that was standing up, I felt many times it was begrudgingly. This was not the governor's best moment, wasn't her best speech. Not a lot of substance with this one. I think the 80s theme was a little too folksy. I mean, listen, she knocked it out of the park last year. This one, again, not her best moment.
Nolan, what were your thoughts? I know you enjoyed that rock and roll sort of motif.
I guess. I kind of expected her to come out, show up Wednesday and talk about this growth council and its agenda that she had touted so heavily and so much was put into. And, you know, this was sort of her moment to knit it all together, talk about what we're going to do step by step by step to get where that council says we need to go. And I didn't see any of that.
But wasn't that really what underpinned most of her priorities? I mean, like free, community college for 2 years.
You know, this idea that if we give away enough goodies, people will come. You know, I don't know that resonated. I think she should have went at the theme a little harder if that's going to be her priority. It was hard to tell from this speech what her priorities are going to be in 2024.
So what were your takeaways?
Yeah, I mean, I think what many of us who have watched this governor now deliver 6 of these speeches, it's hard not to compare to previous. Yeah. And last year, the fact is, she was for the first time in 40 years talking to a Democratic-controlled Lansing. And it was powerful, and Democrats had little printed out sheets early in January. Here's what we're going to get done now that we're in power. And many of those things got done. And now we're in this sort of year where we're going into an election year. It's hard to get a lot done. And so when you look at the actual prescriptive policy proposals that came out of the speech, absolutely, there's caregiving tax credits that she talked about, as you mentioned, community college, universal pre-K. Right. But other than that, it just dynamically wasn't the same, and how powerful it was last year.
It's interesting, Adolph, our most recent poll has the governor at an approval rating in the state of 60%, which is really high for a split state.
What was she smoking? Listen, 4 rotten apples. Listen, community college. Listen, it's chaos in the Detroit public schools. She need to have a game plan. That's great, the free 2-year college. The test scores in Michigan for black students are terrible.
For all students.
Listen, it's ridiculous. You know, electric vehicles. Nobody in Detroit want an electric vehicle because we know where the charging station is going to be at. They're going to be downtown. They're not going to be in the neighborhoods, etc. No, I was disappointed. You know, I'm not a rock and roll guy, and you know, and I'm not a Lions fan. So
I don't know how I had you on the program.
How'd he get in here?
Yeah, I don't know.
But you know, I'm glad for the Lions. But you know what? It was all some kind of carnival she had yesterday. You know, they all dressed in blue, etc. We got some serious issues. Democrats got some serious issues. The Republican Party is in chaos, but yet the Democrats have not taken advantage of that situation.
But Tom, what's the reality, the likelihood that she can get much of this done, given now an exact split in the House, which will exist until at least April,
right?
When they might be able to replace 2 of those seats. But what's the likelihood that anything moves forward in an election year like 2024?
And I'm going to say very little, because not only do you have this 54-54 split, but don't forget, we've got redistricting right now in Southeast Michigan because of the Supreme Court decision. So you've got many of her allies in Detroit might be running against each other. And I think many of them are going to be very timid to touch some of these issues, not knowing who they're going to be running against in the primary this cycle.
They're running against the Democrats. Democrats threw Detroit under the bus. Now they scared. Now Jocelyn Benson want to be governor. Listen, she got to come back and explain why she get against the court case. Oh, man, you're right. You're absolutely right.
It's a mess. Nobody knows what this landscape's going to look like.
Well, it depends what she's willing to trade. I mean, if she's willing to give Republicans a substantive tax break, she might get some of this less offensive stuff done in their eyes. But I mean, they went through what was it, $9 billion and plus in surplus funds, and couldn't find anything for the taxpayers. And I think there's a lot of
there's tax
resentment.
rebates. Is that? I mean, does that not count as something?
It counts for.
I appreciate that it's not what a lot of Republicans
limited
want.
audience. I mean, selective constituency. I thought the tax credits for home care, for caring for your relatives, is a good way to do it. It's better than a direct subsidy. There are indeed tax credits. I agree with that, but Michigan should have had a broad tax cut with all of that money sitting there. Instead, she grew the size of government.
I can tell you right after this speech, we got the live response, actually, and spoke for about 10 minutes with both Minority Leader Matt Hall and Eric Nesbitt. Although they say that there's some compromise to be had, I'm not sure politically, and unfortunately that is what, as Tom Leonard can talk about, that is part of the dynamic here, again, as we're talking about an election year. And what is it that they are going to want to give this governor? And also what we have to think about is Joe Tate, the speaker, who is not in an inevitable position right now. I mean, yes, he is the speaker, but he's got a caucus himself that is trying to figure out how progressive they are. And he's got to figure out now, after the governor has come out and said, these are the proposals I want, how he's going to stack it and whether he can get the votes. And that's not even talking about 54-54. That's talking come April. Aside from the budget, what else can actually get done?
Exactly.
And one issue I think she can get some bipartisan support if she focuses in on, and she touched on this the other night, is the universal pre-K. You know, I said that last year. I think she's onto something there. Republicans have supported it in the past. I think she really needs to focus on what she can actually achieve, and I think that might be one of them.
I wanted to move it, brought it out to national. We've been talking about, obviously, what the national impact will be locally, given how tense and fraught we know that this election year is going to be. But Nolan, your piece today in the Detroit News, for all of the talk about reforming the system, moving primaries earlier, like Michigan, which is, it looks, I mean, this time around, Iowa and New Hampshire have made the decision on the Republican.
Two unrepresentative states voted, and now it's over. And I can't remember a time when Michigan has been so meaningless in the primary, and its vote is just in a couple of weeks, and the race is apparently already over. What I would suggest is starting with a cluster primary like Super Tuesday, make these candidates appeal to a broad electorate, and talk about issues beyond ethanol and pork sausages, and maybe you come up with a better candidate in the end.
Adolph, I don't know how many times you and I on this program have talked about your frustration with the way that this primary system works. But
there's no question. And I was in New Hampshire last year, Concord, the capital. And there's not a lot of people that look like me there or anybody else. And you know what? Those are small states. They need to have the primaries in the states that represent the U.S., you know, South Carolina, Pennsylvania, Ohio, et cetera, Texas. You know, these two states decide. Now, what the ex-president he got 32 delegates, and they're already calling it that he's the winner. I can't blame Nikki Haley for not getting out of the race.
Hope she doesn't.
She's insisting she's going to stay in, but Tom, is this an outlier? Can we not really measure it because this Trump phenomenon is unique?
I don't know. I guess, everything's unique when you're talking about Donald Trump. But, we touched on Nikki Haley. And at one point I did want to get across is I think this next month is going to be very critical for him. I mean, let's face it, he has not done well with suburban women. And over the next month, he is going to be dealing with a female candidate that is very well liked. She is not Hillary Clinton. And he has no room for error when it comes to suburban women. And I think if he's ever going to get them back into his fold, he's got to watch how he treats her over the next month or so.
And he's not, because what should have been a victory speech that he delivered the night of New Hampshire, he was discussing what Nikki Haley was wearing, which let's also remember is not the first time that this president has talked about a female candidate or what she is wearing or her appearance.
This from a guy walking around with a tie dragging the floor.
and this is a guy that remind me when Muhammad Ali changed his name from Cassius Clay to Muhammad Ali. He had people calling him Cassius, and he's calling her by another name.
It was something.
Or other name, yeah.
Yes.
Guys, thanks so much for the conversation. We'll check on this Lions situation over here with Adolph. When we come back, we'll talk EVs. What do you mean you're not a Lions
I've never
fan?
been a Lions.
Welcome back. Interesting headlines lately surrounding electric vehicles, charging problems in extreme temperatures, especially apparently for Tesla owners, diminishing battery range in the cold weather too. Ford announcing a big shift in production of its F-150 Lightning. As I often do, I turn to John McElroy of Autoline to sort things out. John, anybody in the Flashpoint family knows how bullish I am on EVs, but I always point out they're not for everyone yet. I wonder, though, now are more and more people reading this stuff and thinking, ooh, it's really not for me, and do we fall a little further behind?
Well, interesting thing. I even learned a lot over this whole bitter winter EV charging in Chicago. Turns out, and I never knew this before, you have to precondition the battery before you start to charge it. What that means is the battery heats up. So if it's bitter cold, it needs to get the temperature. So what Tesla recommends is that you actually precondition the battery for half an hour to 45 minutes before you plug in and start charging. Yeah. You do it through the center screen, or they've got an app on the phone that you can set it to precondition. If you precondition it, no problems. If you don't, makes it look like the charger's not working. You plug it in, nothing happens. You go to the next charger, nothing happens. So you think they're all broken. We've got to learn how to precondition these batteries. And I got to tell you, as somebody who's bullish on EVs and has test driven almost all of them, I never knew that.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I hadn't thought about it that way much either, but this is one more obstacle. Then people go, oh, now I got to do that a half an hour before I charge. I mean, all this starts to look like a hassle to a lot of people.
It is a hassle, but
it's
how many runs did AAA have to make those bitter cold mornings because somebody's engine wouldn't turn over? Get the jumper cables, they have an old battery. So, we're sort of used to that. We know that happens. This EV stuff, it's all new. And so we think, oh, it's a bunch of problems. I'm not sure that it's really that much of a problem.
It's interesting because we also talk about how the range diminishes. It can be 20% or more.
Or more.
When it's cold, especially when it's really cold.
Right.
But the range of your gas-powered vehicle, it doesn't run as efficiently in cold weather either. We don't talk about that as much. Right?
No, you're right. You lose range with your piston engine in cold weather, but you don't lose as much. And again, it's something that we've all grown up with. We know how to deal with it. This EV stuff is so new, and so when there's a problem, it's headlines across the nation.
Well, then we get Ford saying, okay, we're going to pull back on our F-150 Lightning production. You've talked a lot about how spectacular you think that vehicle is, but they're clearly not moving at the rate that Ford needs for them to keep this. I think they're taking away a whole shift. Right?
They're removing a whole shift. It's not selling in the volume they thought it was.
So what's your concern level about what's happening here?
I think that Ford and probably GM and maybe even Stellantis made a mistake. You know, it's all a race to manufacturing scale because that brings your costs down.
Right.
So what's their biggest selling products? The full-size pickup. So they went, hey, we'll make full-size pickups. We'll get to scale. Well, guess what? Pickup buyers are some of the most conservative buyers in the marketplace. Last thing they want is an electric truck. So the people who have been buying the F-150 Lightning love it. They're gaga over it. They've never owned a pickup before in their lives. In fact, most of them never even owned a Ford before.
That's fascinating.
So, EVs are going to do great in certain parts of the country. They're going to do great in certain parts of the market. Mm-hmm. But until we get the next generation of batteries and platforms and all that, they're not for everybody.
In fact, what can we look forward to as far as battery development that will change a lot of the game here? We do know that they're already talking about solid-state batteries that would hold a much larger charge, perhaps. But this winter problem, what can we look forward to?
Well, look, there's a lot of things going on with batteries. You know, Ford is working with this Chinese company, CATL, to build batteries in Michigan. They don't have any of the problem materials, cobalt, manganese,
right, all of those rare earth
nickel.
Metals, right.
Well, the rare earths are for the engines,
but
not
yes,
for the batteries.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, look, this industry keeps knocking down the batteries. They keep learning on how to make the existing batteries more efficient, lower the cost, and in fact, the solid-state battery, it's got the lithium-ion battery's got such a head start. It's going to be a long time before the solid state catches up.
I know you've also been dismayed at how politicized this whole argument has been. It continues to be. It'll only worsen in 2024.
Right.
The idea that if you're interested at all in an EV, it must be because you're a liberal, and we don't need to be doing, because there's this idea that we're just giving business to China and conceding to the Chinese way here.
Yeah, look, I've argued all along that there's a national security component to all of this. I've said this before, I'll say it again. When the U.S. military drops our war fighters into a combat zone, those war fighters have 18 pounds of battery in their gear for night vision, for communication. Where do you think those batteries come from? Most of them come from China. So we've got to get off our dependence on China. It's not just for electric vehicles, but we need the electric vehicles to give us the scale to open mines here, to open processing centers here. So that's why I argue, look, this EV thing is not just for the climate. It's also a national security component.
The other thing, lastly, I wanted to make sure we got to, back to the winter issue, is you note where the most electric vehicles are sold in the world.
Yeah. So per capita, the highest EV ownership in the world is #1 Norway, then Sweden, then Finland, then Iceland. I mean, way north of us, way up by the Arctic Circle. They don't have problems plugging in their electric cars. Why? Because they learned all about how you have to precondition the battery years ago.
These are places pretty familiar with really, really cold weather.
They do. They know it.
It's absolutely fascinating. John, it's always good to talk to you. I appreciate you sorting this out for me, and I know we'll talk. Oh, are you concerned about the future of the auto show now that we're moving back to winter?
It's great for the public. Great for the public.
Yeah, something to, and probably the hotels and restaurants, I imagine, too. Yeah. John McElroy of Autoline Detroit. We come back as we approach the NFC title game. Reflections from a Lions fan. Me. This is Flashpoint on Local 4. You may know I'm not a native Michigander, but after nearly 30 years here, that hardly seems to matter, it seems. I am you, and we are the Lions faithful. I actually grew up a Washington fan, but in middle school, my next-door neighbor loved the Lions. His family was from Detroit, and that was when I first developed a fondness for this long-beleaguered team. My favorite Lion was Lem Barney. I liked Greg Landry, too, and it was an absolute thrill when I got to meet both of them about 25 years later.
Mitchell gets to Sanders. Sanders has got some room to operate.
And I was, of course, a Barry Sanders fan. Like me, he's a native Kansan. And like me, he came to Detroit via Oklahoma. And so when I moved to Detroit in 1995, the Lions helmet fit me pretty well. And when the Lions moved downtown to Ford Field, I immediately signed up for season tickets. And my son Griffin and I started our own Detroit tradition.
Detroit and Reichel just down at 8 seconds left.
No, he can't do that. It was fourth down.
Fourth down.
He couldn't do that
the game's over. He did it.
I got initiated pretty quickly. The Lions were often confounding. From Bobby Ross's soul-searching,
Detroit wins the toss. They give the Bears the ball. Detroit takes the win. 40-yard field goal, Edinger. Good.
to Marty Morningwig taking the wind instead of the ball in overtime.
Personal foul, face mask, number 98 defense.
And no team has been more aggrieved by ridiculous and inept officiating.
There's a kick. It is up. It is no good.
Sure, Buffalo Bills fans can tell you about wide right.
Ernest Biner. Fumble the ball, and Denver has recovered. Oh, my.
And Cleveland fans still talk about the fumble, but it sounds a lot better than completing the process, or we're picking up the flag, a 10-second runoff, or the most recent indignity, Decker reported as eligible. I am not the fair weather type. When I'm in for keeps. After the 0-16 season, friends wondered if I would give up my tickets. Absolutely not. For starters, it's players. I've been able to watch Barry and Herman and Matthew and Calvin. And beyond the Lions, Ford Field has let me watch the likes of Peyton Manning, Tom Brady, Lamar Jackson, and yes, insufferable as he may be, Aaron Rodgers. But more than that, I believe that a rich life means having passion, and a rooting interest is passion. Heartbreaking? Sure. Infuriating? Oh, yes. But by being through almost 30 years of living and often dying with the Detroit Lions, this year has been all the more extraordinary. I have rejoiced on the mountaintop because I have lived in the valley.
I wanted this job bad because I felt like I knew this community. I played here.
By staying in the fold, I was here when Moses arrived to finally lead us out of the wilderness. And heaven knows I had bought into too many false prophets. Steve Mariucci was going to turn everything around. I was sure of that. Matt Millen, now there's a guy who knows football. Matt Patricia, he's a genius, and we got him. But after so many bad dates, I finally found Mr. Right.
What are we? What makes us what we are and what we're going to be? I think it's that right there. It's grit. It's what we started with last year, guys. All you guys that were in here. It's our core foundation, man.
I've always been a fan of Grit. Grit was the name of a delightful rural newspaper introduced to me by my grandfather. Spending a lot of time in the South, I do love grits for breakfast, and shrimp and grits would probably be my death row meal. And grit is what I want from my football team. Dan, you had me at grit.
We're going to get up, and on the way up, we're going to bite a kneecap off.
While some rolled their eyes at his war on kneecaps, I found myself believing in Dan Campbell, which, to be honest, really didn't matter. What mattered was that the guys in the room believed in Dan Campbell. And he believed in them. And with every seemingly crazy decision to go for it on fourth down or fake a punt, he was telling them, I believe in you. And he did it so often that they started to believe in themselves. Now, of course, I want the Lions to win, but you know, a more accurate way of saying it is I don't want this season to end. This kind of joy, this family that it's created, it is such a rare thing. I fear it'll never quite feel this way again, no matter how much success might be ahead. I just want this to last, because I have lived in the valley. Just let me linger on the mountaintop a little longer. You know, I've always been jealous of places like Baltimore and Pittsburgh and New England that are always in the mix, always something to root for in January. Isn't it great fun? That's going to do it for this morning. Thank you so much for being here. Meet the Press coming up next. Have a great week. We'll see you next time on Flashpoint. And go Lions.